Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome you once again this evening to the airwaves of Salam Media. It is Wednesday nights. It is Talk with Inayet Wadee, our weekly panel discussion. And we welcome our listeners, our viewers on the various platforms of Salam Media this evening. Glad that you are able to join us. Now, we have come through at a very, very critical time, particularly in the United Kingdom. And for those of us who have been following developments in the UK, we've seen the riots that have been taking place with death, destruction to property as well. And the UK again bracing itself for another day of unrest with far more race riots that are reportedly being planned across various cities. Now, it's interesting to note that these riots obviously have their roots in racism. And we find that politicians, we find even mainstream media using terms such as unrest, disorder, anti-immigration protests. But in reality, these are fascist, racist, supremacists, and we've seen it from the actions as well. And this is what we're going to do tonight, is to understand what this is all about, and particularly looking at it from an Islamophobic perspective as well. And this is the reason why we are going to be joined shortly by two brothers from the United Kingdom who are no strangers to Salam Media. We've got Mazhar Khan, who is a Muslim speaker and an activist, and also Dr. Abdul Wahid, UK-based political commentator. After around 8 p.m., we have got two more guests who will be joining us. So we've got Sheikh Michael Momisa and also Mabrur Ahmed, who will be joining us at around 8 p.m. So we've got quite a full program this evening, but right now let's go across to the UK to welcome our two brothers, Brother Mazhar Khan and Dr. Abdul Wahid.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Nice to be with you again, Brother Inayet.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, Dr. Abdul Wahid, let's begin with you. And clearly, when one looks at the developments in the last week or so, and the point that I had made is mainstream media, politicians, a very, very mild definition, for want of a better term, considering what is actually happening and what actually lies behind all this destruction and death and this cancer of racism and fascism that has reared its ugly head in the UK.
Indeed. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Yeah, very much it's reared its ugly head. It's been this dormant monster lying below the surface for a very long time, rumbling away. And the trigger was this tragic stabbing and murder of three little girls. And apart from the lies and disinformation that were being spread about the background of the murderer, it was just crazy to me that why people would look at the person's religion, skin color, where their parents were born as a motivation for this kind of act. So that's the first issue, whether or not people got it right or got it wrong. It's just the fact that so many times when a crime is committed, and it's committed by somebody of a certain color or a certain faith or a minority, the focus becomes on their identity, their ethnic identity, their religious identity. Same crime committed by somebody who's white British, and it's just about the crime, really. Actually, quite often they're making excuses about the mental health of the person and the background of the person and the social circumstances of the person, which is all very justifiable because a lot of those things contribute to crime. But we see this disgusting double standard. And you know what? Even though the politicians here have taken a stance on law and order, they say they're going to get more police out, they're going to have courts sitting 24 hours, they're going to deal with it in double quick time, they're going to send people to prison for the crime. This is management. This is not leadership. Leadership is moral leadership, isn't it? Leadership is saying that why in 21st century Britain do we feel the need to have to focus on Muslims or migrants or minorities as problems rather than as people? Why we as politicians, they should have said, our leader, Keir Starmer, should have said in Britain, why the leader, the prime minister here, should have said, why we politicians for the last 2 decades have got it wrong by stirring up hatred against these minorities, against Muslims and migrants and minorities for their own failings of policy, whether it was following policy or domestic policy. If you start with a bit of contrition and a bit of honesty and a bit of leadership, and you appeal to the, I don't know, 70% of people that really, 80% of people that don't want to have anything to do with this thuggery and rioting, you can actually start showing some moral leadership. But we won't see anything of that because these politicians, sadly, are very much part of the problem. For 20 years, they have been what they call dog whistling, where they make these signals to the public about the problems of these people, Muslims, migrants, and minorities. Their friends in the corporate media, in the state media, do exactly the same. It's escalated with the war in Gaza, the slaughter in Gaza, the dehumanization of the Palestinians, and the excuses they made for the occupier, the labeling of peaceful marches as being hate marches, and the labeling of rioting and thuggery on the streets as being protests. It's all what we've seen before. In fact, this has become a distraction this week from the much worse problem around the world, whether it's in Gaza or Sudan or Congo or many other places in the world that are in crisis. And in the end, we're looking at these very noisy things going on here, which thank God, thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are not, as troubling as they are in the scale of human problems. They are not the worst problems in the world. And we need to get some perspective on that, I feel.
Jazakallah for that, Brother Abdul Wahid. Brother Mazhar, just following up, and I think what is also important to understand is we're seeing a bigger picture emerging from what Brother Abdul Wahid is saying, and also the emergence of the modern far right. Now, we knew this was coming. We've seen it right across Europe. We've seen it across many governments in Europe. And the UK has been no different. We've seen Muslims obviously being under pressure, being under threat for a better part of the last 20-odd years or so as well. So we are not surprised that this modern far right has become quite a formidable force in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Language is very important. When we were children at school, at primary school, the teacher would tell us, don't fight. It doesn't matter if people call you names. And they used to have this rhyme, which they used to say, sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt. And this is a rhyme that taught all the kids that if people call you names, it doesn't matter. As long as you don't fight, it doesn't matter. Just ignore. But it's the language that has been used over the last 2-3 decades, which has created an environment, a fertile environment for people who hate foreigners, people who hate Muslims, to germinate and to grow and to give them courage to increase this hatred. So name calling, using languages has created a hatred, and then it's that hatred and that misconception and those lies which fuel violence, which fuel the riots, which fuel hatred, and can lead to not just death, destruction of property, but also to killing of people. So, like you've mentioned, and like Abdul Wahid also mentioned, that this language which has been used not by extremists, people on the fringes, this has been used by mainstream media, mainstream politicians over the last 2 decades and more, which has demonized Muslims. If somebody said that right at the onset of this killing of these girls in Southport, that a white European Christian has killed some girls, let's say, for example, that was a news story, nobody would have got upset. Why? Because there hasn't been propaganda about white European Christians, even though they're responsible for anti-Semitism for two centuries, even though they're responsible for colonization, even though they're responsible for wars around the world, even though they're responsible for racism, You know, there was a right for people to get upset. Oh, white, European, Christian, again, getting up to no good. But that's not the narrative. That's not the language that is being used to demonize a particular group of people. But Muslims, immigrants, Islam, these words have these words they have used have demonized these things. So if you just say that a person of an immigrant who is a Muslim has killed girls, young children, let's not say girls, they're children, just beyond being babies, to be quite honest, this has inflamed passions. Why? Because the politicians and the mainstream media have created that environment, and they have probably been reading the guidebook of, what was his name, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda for the Nazis. If you continue to tell a lie, if you continue to demonize a people, then people will accept it and people will believe it. And that is why we are where we are today. The mainstream politicians in the West, not just in Britain, but in the West, America, the European world, Australia, they have created this environment where it is legitimate for people to be angry against Muslims, against Islam, and against immigrants. And they have legitimized that. So as Abdul Wahid said, that, you know, they are managing the situation. They're not showing any kind of leadership. And they are to blame for that, because most of the people are ignorant. And it is not wrong to say that people do have legitimate concerns in Britain, because there is a cost of living crisis. There is a problem with the economy. There is a problem with people being able to look after their families. And the blame for that is the economic system, is the politics, is the policies, and is the system that is imposed on these lands. That's where the blame lies. So it's very convenient for the politicians to deflect the blame and blame somebody else rather than the real problem, which is the system that is in place over these people.
Well, Jazakallah for that, Brother Mazhar. Abdul Wahid, just following up and talking about a system, and let's just try and understand racism and fascism as an ideology in terms of who fuels it, why is it fueled. Now, we've seen the modern far right. We've seen they are no longer made up of organizations with clear structures, but we see an international, we even see online networks. It is basically a movement that spreads around a shared ideology. And there are many people, you look at influencers, you look at leaders who actually use their power to put out some of these statements to fuel the racist supremacist ideology, and accompanied by fascism.
Yes, this is correct, and I think we have. I divide the current problem into, if you like, three categories. One we've talked about, which is the establishment, where politicians and media have demonized minorities, and they do that for a reason, whether it is, in the case of Britain and America, demonizing Muslims because of their foreign policy in the war on terror, or demonizing Muslims who support the Palestinians against the occupation of Palestine, or whether it's, as Mazhar has said, a failure of successive governments in the system to look after their own people, their own poor people, and blaming that on the migrant issue. Then you have, I think, two other problems in addition to that. One is really quite systemic, and that is the political construct in the world today is the nation state, where borders are linked to the identity of a country and a nation, and very often that's linked to an ethnicity as well. So very much in Europe, it is, your country being English or being French or being German historically is associated with a white Anglo-Saxon in the case of England, or an Aryan in the case of German identity. So the race goes with the political identity of the state. And that is problematic everywhere. So that is, you will see that is the flag waving racist, fascist in every country uses those symbols. And unfortunately, we see that in the Muslim countries as well. So in Turkey, for example, there is a lot of racism against Syrian refugees that have been there since the crisis unfolded in Syria. In Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees that came in from Myanmar, they were treated as outsiders, even though they're Muslim. And in Pakistan, just this year, the government talked in very ugly terms about Afghanis in the country who had come there as refugees. So you can see where nationalism exists, where the nation state exists, where Islam is absent, you will get these very ugly things. And of course, our Prophet ﷺ, he overcame this so beautifully when he himself migrated to Medina from Mecca with his companions who were the Muhajirun, the migrants. And he took the resident people of Medina, the Ansar, and what did he do? He didn't say, you are one tribe and you are one tribe and you're different. He said, no, you are brothers. And he literally made the ones with plenty look after the ones who had nothing at the time, who'd left everything behind, until they were on a more settled footing. And then that responsibility was no longer a responsibility on them. So it gives you one example of how Islam overcame this. So the systemic racism of the nation state is there. And the last thing is what you've touched upon, which is really these online influencers, these networks around the world, which are actually encouraged behind the scenes. Now, it would be a mistake to just think of some of these people as lone wolves. Some of them, without question, are just narcissists. They want to go online, they want to get supporters, they want to get more viewers. Viewers translates into dollars. So they just say what wins them the biggest audience. So some of them are narcissists. But many of them have backing. So in the case of one of the most famous ones in the UK, Tommy Robinson, the links between him and the Zionist supporters around the world and financing of his work, his legal fees, things like that, has been quite well documented. In the case of, Mazhar mentioned Goebbels back in the Nazi era in Germany, the propagandist. But actually, if you look more recently in America, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's advisor, he had a philosophy of propaganda, using the internet, using social media, flood it with disinformation in order to achieve what you need to achieve. And he spoke very explicitly about anti-Muslim stuff. He's had backers with big money trying to disrupt. And it would be wrong to think these kind of people are not anti-establishment. They're anti the current dominant faction in the establishment. They're trying to disrupt that. Like Trump is from the establishment, but he's trying to disrupt the other faction within it. And this is what we are seeing. And you know, Bannon has complimented Nigel Farage, who's a very prominent right-wing politician in the UK who agitates on this sort of thing. He's supported Tommy Robinson. He's encouraged conservative politicians here in the UK to support Nigel Farage's party. So you can see there are some very dark forces behind these seemingly lone wolf agitators. And aside from that, yeah, you do have underground networks across Europe and across the world promoting far-right fascism. They are capable of doing damage to individuals. I don't know what the extent they have to actually change things radically in the world, the way that maybe the Trumps and the Bannons are trying to do. Britain is not like America. America is much more divided. I mean, you know, Elon Musk is sitting over in America saying Britain's at civil war. Well, I think he's forgotten about the 6th of January 2020, when there literally was a civil war on the streets of Washington. And, you know, there isn't to that extent the level of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people that support that kind of narrative here. It is in more the hundreds or thousands, I think. But I don't know if anyone really has any concrete data on that.
Yes. Also, Mazhar, when one looks at Islamophobia and Islamophobia, and clearly this has mushroomed over a period of time, where we had Islamophobia, and particularly in Europe, in the UK, and many other parts in the Western world, where we speak about Islamophobia, whether it was the hijab, or whether it was the burning of the Quran, whether it was a character assassination of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we've seen various forms of Islamophobia. But this is a movement that has mushroomed out of that thought, out of that ideology, and to the extent now that they're taking it to another level, where we see a movement that is breaking out into a world accompanied by violence, accompanied by racist outbursts, accompanied by attacks. And all of this in front of the world. It is filmed, it is live streamed across the entire world. And each action obviously tells us a story, because this is obviously creating an atmosphere of insecurity, of fear, but also, again, calling it anti-immigrant. But in reality, this is something else.
Yeah, even when they use the word immigrant, it's synonymous with being Muslim. So, to the lay person here in the UK, the ordinary common man in the UK, for him, in most cases, for him, an immigrant is indistinguishable from a Muslim. And you see, they talk about it synonymously about immigrants and Muslims. So just a few days ago, one of the lords, I forget his name now, one of the lords in the House of Lords, he gave a speech, very Islamic phobic, very full of tropes, full of lies, full of all sorts of nonsense, saying that Muslims are a threat to Britain. And he's speaking in the House of Lords as a respected elder statesman. He's saying Muslims have 4 wives, Muslims have 2 children per wife. He goes, their population growth is 10 times our population growth, and within a number of years they're gonna outnumber us. Coming out with complete ridiculous stuff like that. In Britain, it is illegal to have 2 wives. It's the law. Nobody here has legally got 2 wives or 4 wives in Britain. However, a person, can have a different partner every day of the week. That's not illegal. There are men here, they do not know how many children they have fathered. And they joke about it. Sometimes in the office, when you say to somebody, "Oh, you married? How many kids have you got?" He goes, "Oh, 2 that I know about." And that's like a jovial thing that, we sleep around. I don't know, I may have other children. So the fact is that they may be producing more children than Muslims, right? Possibly, Allahu Alam. But the point is, Muslims don't have 4 wives in Britain. And if people do have more than 1 wife, it's a very small number of people, although Islam does permit it. British law doesn't permit it. Islam absolutely does permit it. But to say that there is a population explosion because there are Muslims, there are immigrants coming to this country, is total nonsense. And it's that kind of fear-mongering which has created and inflamed the passions of the people against the Muslims and against immigrants. And this is not something new. Abdul Wahid mentioned the very fact that because you have nation states, it is intrinsic that because of the nation state construct, you are going to have an us and them mentality. You are going to have this dislike of the foreigner. And a nation state is actually only held together by the dislike of the foreigner. If you take that away, what is it that makes a nation? What is what is Britain? When the British people say, "We want Britain back," if you actually said to them, "What does that mean?" they will not be able to define it. Because what is a British person? There are people in Britain who don't identify as British. If you go to Liverpool, many people in Liverpool will say, "We are not British, we are Scousers. We are the Republic of Scousland. We are not British." If you go to Cornwall, they'll say, we are Celts. We are not British. We are not part of Britain. And we have the North-South divide. You've got these things about, people joke about the divide between Lancashire and Yorkshire, and we'll go back to the War of the Roses, which took place many hundreds of years ago when Lancashire had a war with Yorkshire. So there are so many divisions within Britain. So if you take away the foreigner, the whole this idea of nationalism is imploding. It will implode. It cannot hold a nation together unless you create an enemy. So that's why historically, whenever a nation has had problems, they will always fan the flames of hatred for the immigrant in order to unify the people. So that's what we are seeing now across the Western world, because the Western world, the failures of the Western world is more prominent today in terms of economics, in terms of society, in terms of their politics. And therefore, they have turned against the foreigner. And we've seen this in the past. We saw with Margaret Thatcher over the Falklands War when she was having a crisis. But I did a video recently, and you can see that even William Shakespeare spoke about this. When in the opening scene of his play, Henry IV, he was having so many problems in Britain. There was wars taking place in Scotland. There was secessionist movement in Wales, and there was all sorts of domestic problems. So he gave an opening speech. So William Shakespeare laid out this scenario of his play, the context of the play, that Britain is facing so many problems. So King Henry IV of Britain, he declares that we will go to war against the Muslims in the Holy Lands, hoping that this will unify the people at home and quell the problems and take their minds off the problems that they have today. And this is exactly what we are seeing playing out in the Western world today because of the failure of capitalism and the failure of their democratic, secular, liberal values.
Yes, Brother Abdul Wahid, I noticed on more than one occasion you mentioned what has been happening in Gaza, and it is clear that Gaza has actually changed the world. It's changed the world the way we see the world. It has obviously mobilized people right across the entire world. We see it across many cities around the world, people on the ground that have come to terms and reality with the Zionist ideology. And this fascist ideology is no different from the Zionist ideology. And we find that these claims that are being made over and over again, that Britain is under attack by Muslim men. And this is repeated over and over again. And once again, to change world opinion, but also at the same time in terms of incitement. Incitement of this far right's ultimate goal to create genocidal civil war within their own countries.
Yes, I mean this is something that has been written about in terms of the Bannon kind of type agenda to hijack these states, and it's the same type of violence that drove what I said on the January the 6th coup attempt in America. And frankly, so much of what is said is nonsense. I mean, the most pernicious thing we saw was the accusation that the murderer of those little girls was a Muslim. But you know, there have been people on the streets at these standing on the fringes of these riots, supporting them, making absurd comments. One woman was talking about the fact that the English feel like the Native Americans, who are being extinguished from their own society. I mean, Britain is a country of about 70 million people, and 80 to 90% are the indigenous white Anglo-Saxon people. It's like these are bizarre comments, and actually, on a day-to-day level, on a street-to-street level, on a neighbor-to-neighbor level, colleague-to-colleague level, I think people get on. Actually, most of the time, people do get on. Events like this allow the people to mobilize everyone's anxieties about different things. So somebody's worried about the change in the culture in this country. A lot of people are genuinely worried about the fact that the services here for the ordinary people, whether it's education, health, housing, the availability of jobs, are not there for a lot of ordinary people. And then they hear politicians or these agitators online linking that to the issue of migrants. Well, the blame there is not on the migrants. The blame there is on the failure of policy, as I've said before. Gaza has changed everything in the sense that it has made people wake up to the way that these states in the West operate. And that is a political crisis for them here, because they have to answer to their own people about why they're supporting a genocide. And I think it's no coincidence that this kind of rioting has started at a time where people were very concerned about their government's attitude to the genocide, and now they're going to be more concerned about what their government's attitude to rioting in the street is here and the causes behind it. And it's a massive distraction from what is going on at the moment. So I think that what direction? I mean, you probably don't realize this sitting in South Africa, but this evening there has been a lot of scheduled, planned rioting, inverted commas, protests, rumored across the UK. There's been no official declaration by anyone that this is going to happen, but it's like a rumor. It's going to happen in about 20 or 30 different towns and cities at once. Whether that happens or not is a different matter. I don't think we'll know whether it's going to happen until it happens, really. But it raises anxiety. It raises people's anxiety. It makes people worry about things. It makes people change their behaviors, stay at home when we would be going out, we would be going to the masjid, we would be, doing these things. Personally, I think there's a need for people to take reasonable precautions, particularly for our loved ones. But at the same time, mustn't let this bullying stop us from speaking out. You gave the example of the Prophet ﷺ. What a beautiful example. Physically abused in Mecca, insulted in Mecca, slandered in Mecca. And what was his response? He remained steadfast. He was never afraid to speak the truth. He was never afraid to give the arguments from the Quran or from the Sunnah. He was never afraid to criticize legitimate things that warranted criticism. Sometimes, if there were jahil people insulting him, he would walk on by and ignore it. And that was a good example for us when you sometimes get jahil people insulting you. He had the most impeccable character and conduct and manners and integrity. So, and he was reliant on Allah. He trusted in Allah to help him. He had tawakkul in Allah and he relied only on Allah. These are core things which will stand us in very good stead as Muslims if we learn from that experience in our time today.
Yes. And also, Mazhar, what is interesting, and we're speaking about terminology as well. And when we look at the civil unrest, when we look at the civil war that is being incited, referred to as Day X. Now, this I found quite interesting because Elon Musk also spoke about this, where he spoke about civil war being inevitable in the United Kingdom. And it's just an interesting dynamic that here you're talking about Day X and you're talking about the owner of X, Elon Musk, making such statements.
Like we've already covered, they've created this environment. So when people say ridiculous things like that, it actually resonates with the people because this is what they've been hearing. But we as Muslims should ask ourselves, why is it that ridiculous things are being said and they have attraction with the people? And there's an element of responsibility we have. And I think to a large extent, we have abandoned this responsibility. And that is, having effective da'wah. So, a lot of the problems that the people face in Britain, elsewhere in the world as well, are legitimate concerns, like we mentioned about food, housing, jobs, economics, all of this stuff, political representation, being listened to by people of power. They feel they don't have influence, they don't have power. This is their problems. What the system is doing is, this is because our national health service is failing, everything's failing because of immigrants. Now, we as Muslims have a responsibility to engage with that society, to do effective da'wah, and had we en masse done effective da'wah to say, look, you have economic problems because of your economic system. Britain is very, very wealthy. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, I had a conversation with a taxi driver, and that was the time the first BNP local councillor won a seat in an election. And the white taxi driver was trying to be sympathetic towards me, saying, oh, this is not good, a white guy has, this BNP guy has a racist Islamophobe, has won a seat and he's got political power. And I was trying to toy with him, and I said, well, it's a democracy. He got more votes than the next guy. He won. More people voted for him. So what's your problem? And he felt a bit bemused. He thought, I'm trying to be supportive of you, as a Muslim. Surely you're not happy. I said, look, why is it that people feel a hatred towards the West? I said, towards the Muslims and immigrants. I said, they are not your problem. And I said to him, I said, look, listen, when Britain was the richest nation on God's earth, when you had the empire, when Australia was yours, when Southern Africa was yours, when Canada was yours, when India was yours, when Britain was the richest nation on earth, you had no quote unquote black people and brown people in Britain. You had no Muslims in Britain. Tell me, how was the working class doing in Britain then? You had workhouses. You had no job security. You had, your children used to play in the street without shoes. You had no bathrooms. You had, pandemics and epidemics of diseases, and you people work 7 days a week. I said, you only have to read Charles Dickens to get an insight into what life was like for the vast majority of British people in Britain when Britain was the wealthiest nation on God's earth. You had no black and brown people to blame then. Then your problem was your system and your politics, and today your problem is your system and your politics. If all the black and brown people were kicked out of Britain, your lot will not change. You will still have your problems. So we should have had effective da'was to say your problems about economics is because of your economic system. This is what Islam says. Your politicians don't listen to you. You don't have no accountability. You can't hold them to account. This is what Islam says about politics and holding rulers to account. About your societal problems, when you've got this confusion about this gender confusion, when your children are being unruly, you're trying to blame somebody else for that. Your culture is to blame to that. What does Islam say about that? Had we engaged in effective da'was, more of the people would have actually thought, you know what, Islam is a solution for us. Islam is not the problem. And this is what we have not done. We've had Muslims in Britain standing in town centers handing out roses, right? I'm not saying that's wrong, but that doesn't explain to them what their problem is. Like Abdul Wahid very correctly said, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was abused. What's important to understand is at the age of 40, when he became a prophet, up to that point, he was absolutely loved and respected and liked by every single person in Mecca. He was called Al-Amin. He was called As-Sadiq. There is not a single case or narration to say that somebody had some kind of problem with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had the best character. But that, when he became a prophet and he started to convey the message of Islam, people started to hate him. So if his character wasn't able to defend him from the attacks of the non-Muslims when he preached about Islam, what chance do we have with our characters? So the way to counter that was to do da'wah and to explain to them that only the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the unity of mankind, whether you are black, whether you are brown, whether you're African, whether you're European, under the submission of Allah is the one which will bring our hearts together and unite us and get rid of this evil of racism and nationalism. Had we engaged in effective da'wah to present Islam as a solution for the ills of Western society, then maybe we would not find as many people buying into this nonsense and the lies and the propaganda that is being churned out by such influential politicians, influential social media people, and influential, business people like Elon Musk.
Jazakallah. I know, Abdul Wahid, you've got to leave in about 4 minutes from now. Just some final thoughts before we take leave of you.
You're on mute.
How this is going to play out is difficult to know. I think many of us who've been in Europe ever since the Bosnian genocide have wondered how it happened that people turned on their neighbors. I have people who I've known who've lived in India, for example, who lived through the Gujarat genocide and other massacres in India, and saw very quickly how neighbor turned on neighbor. I have no idea whether that's where things are going in Britain. I'm generally an optimist. I generally think these things make us as a community closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I hope that people in our community find the balance between keeping our people safe, our families safe, keeping our mosques safe, and not falling into a trap, which is to be provoked to behave as a mirror image of the other side. That is a big danger for us. The more we understand the drivers behind this, the political drivers behind this, the more I think we can be enlightened as to how to respond. and particularly if we stick close to our deen of Islam, because that gives us exactly the right balance, where you know how much you have to protect your family and your community, and how much you have to ignore of Jahiliyyah, and how much you have to debate and argue and discuss and be steadfast on the truth. And really, those are the balances that we have to find going forward in the days and weeks, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khairan so much for that, Brother Abdul Wahid. And
Barakallah
obviously, we understand you need to take leave of us, but we thank you. We say Jazakallah for your time with us.
Thank you very much to you, Brother Inayet, and your viewers, and my brother Mazhar, who it's nice to see face to face after so long. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, we'll continue with you, Mazhar, alhamdulillah, and always wonderful having Abdul Wahid with us as well. And just to continue and to follow up from what Abdul Wahid had to say in terms of us as Muslims, and particularly where you are in the UK, and I'm sure Muslims in Europe as well, in other parts around the world, who have actually faced a similar scenario with regard to right-wing supremacists being on the receiving end of these ideologies in more ways than one. Just looking at it from a Muslim perspective, obviously there is that fear, which is natural. He spoke about the masajid, he spoke about protecting family, protecting our institutions, our children, all of that as well. But just looking at it where we are at this point in time, and where this these protests are at this point in time, what is the thinking? What are Muslims saying?
Generally speaking, the Muslims, the majority of view is let the police handle it. Don't get involved, because by getting involved, what will happen, and what has happened is the racist protesters, they've been burning cars, they've been throwing bricks at buildings, they've been lynching people, and they've been widespread violence, right? And even with all of this going on, mainstream politicians have been trying to, some, not all of them, of course, some have been trying to justify that these people have legitimate concerns about immigration, about Muslims and this. So they're trying to justify and explain away this. Now, if Muslims get involved, they just have to put one foot wrong, and then the entire media focus will turn to the Muslims as being equally responsible for the violence which is taking place. So there was one incident which took place, I think it was yesterday, where there was a group of Muslim youths walking past a pub in Birmingham, and they came out because they heard that the racists were coming to their locality. So they came out as a counter demonstration to protect their community. Now what happened is one person in the pub started to goad the crowd, saying, come on, let's have you, goading them. One Muslim responded by jumping over the wall and giving him a punch and knocking that guy down. And then another guy came to kick him, and the person who punched him stopped the other person, because then he realized this is going to escalate. So to stop him. But the whole media focused on that Muslims are now, not the whole media, sorry, some elements of the media focused on that to say that, look, the Muslims are also causing violence. Why are the police not arresting them? So the very next day, the Muslim community went to the pub, apologized. They said, any damage done, we will rebuild it. The anger wasn't against you. It was against the individual who was goading us. So, they tried to repair that. But that's the danger, that if the Muslims now try to defend their communities, we will be now painted as co-responsible for the violence which is taking place. So let the police do the job. Let the police protect the communities. Let the police protect the masajids, and work with the police in the sense that, take the advice from the police of what can we legitimately do in order to protect our communities, and how can we help in order to maintain the peace. Because we must not take the focus away from who the perpetrators of the violence are. So that is the general feeling amongst the Muslims. There are some people saying, no, we need to go and fight with them. We need to have counter protests. But, look, the counter protests will be put in a bad light, and they will equate you with the people who are perpetrating the violence. And we don't want to have that equivocation that we are equal to them, because we are not. We are coming out to defend our communities. They are coming out to cause violence. So that's the general advice.
Exactly. And also, I think, Mazhar, sometimes, people have very short memories. And when one looks at these mobilizations from the far right that is taking place, and when one looks at the political rhetoric, when one looks at policy, and we've seen it even during the Trump era as well, with his anti-immigration policies as well, and even the Labor Department in the United Kingdom, where I've actually read about talking about them prioritizing a law and order approach and stood on an anti-migrant position, where Starmer actually, and there's a comment that came out in one of the British newspapers saying, and I'll quote that, "I'll make sure we get planes going off back to the countries where people come from." And now there is this about turn and referring to these people as thugs and all sorts of things as well. But again, looking at it from a political perspective, looking at this rhetoric that has been repeated over and over again by politicians.
No, that's correct, Inayet, because the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, the previous government and now the current government, they actually agree that immigration is a problem, right? They only differ in how it should be dealt with. So, on that point, they agree. Because they've created this environment, they've enraged the people, and there's a large body of people in Britain who have a dislike for immigrants because they blame them for the failures happening, especially with the National Health Service, especially to do with schooling and to do with the economy. And they've created that atmosphere. So the point is now they have to pander to them. And this is what the Labour Party did. The Labour Party has pandered to the anti-Islamic, anti-immigrant feeling in the population in order to win votes. So when the recent elections happened, they completely ignored the Muslims. The Muslims came out, those who believed that we are going to punish the government by voting for somebody else, and people who were saying that, the Labour Party wasn't bothered about that, because they knew that even if the Muslims don't vote for us, it's not going to have that kind of a material impact on the number of seats we are going to win. So they won those seats, and they didn't even pander to the Muslim vote. They didn't want the Muslim vote. They weren't interested. So that says a lot, because they were actually appealing to the racists and the anti-immigrant feeling in the country that we are with you, that we are with you. We are not going to go out of our ways to be pleasant to the Muslims. The vast majority of Muslims in this country are third generation Muslim. We are born and brought up here. Many people, their parents are born and brought up here. So, we are not immigrants, but we are viewed as immigrants. And, I think I mentioned to you in one of your previous programs that there's laws on the statute books now in Britain, whereby if a person commits a serious crime, they can be repatriated to the country their grandfather came from. So like if somebody's grandfather was born in Gujarat in India, this chap has never been to Gujarat in India. He's never been to India. Maybe he doesn't even speak Gujarati. Maybe his first language is English. But if he commits a serious crime, he can be repatriated to India. Whereas an English person who commits the same crime, he's not being sent off anywhere. So that now, legally speaking, shows you that the citizenship of a non-white British is not equal to the citizenship of a white British person. So, it's their fact that it's there in law. You cannot argue with that. It's there in law that the citizenship of a non-white is not equal to the citizenship of a white British person. So, they've created this environment, and they're pandering to them, and the laws even reflect that now.
Yes, and also, Mazhar, when one looks at the political will to stop these riots that are taking place, it's good enough where you can commit billions, send your armies out to Iraq, send your armies out to Afghanistan, commit billions by providing arms to Netanyahu to continue with his genocidal war. Yet at home, you're impotent, you're unable to do anything, you're not even able to commit your army to stop these riots.
They say necessity is that which gives rise to invention. You know, every invention, when you're forced to do something, you come up with a novel idea or a novel solution. And we saw that at the time of COVID. At the time of COVID here in Britain, they found the money in order to help people who were not able to go to work. They were able to find housing for all the homeless people in England, because no homeless person was allowed to sleep out in the streets during COVID. So that just goes to show, when there's a will, there is a way. So when you need to find a solution, you will find a solution. And they found the money, they found the solutions, and they were able to deal with those issues. The point here is, now, when it comes to the National Health Service, when it comes to society, when it comes to the economy, the will is not there because they don't want to solve these problems. When they want to fund the war in Ukraine, when they want to fund the Zionists, they can find the billions of pounds from wherever. They will borrow the money in order to do this, because that's something they feel that they need to do. So that in itself speaks very clearly that the money needed to solve the national health problem here in Britain, the money needed to solve the economic problems, is a fraction of what they spend on illegal wars and the fraction of what they spend in doing all these other things. So if they want to do it, they can do it. Look at how the Labour Party, when there was a suspicion of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, within a few months, they expelled any member who even had a suspicion of being anti-Semitic. They were kicked out of the Labour Party. They were taken out of the Labour Party, and they did all of that. Now, with the rampant Islamophobia which exists in all the parties, they have done nothing. So this speaks volume about having a will and having a solution. They don't have a will because they don't want to solve that problem. And this is unfortunately something that the vast majority of the people don't see, that the problems that they have in Britain are not unsurmountable. They are solvable. The failure of the hospitals, the National Health Service, is solvable. The problem with the economy is solvable, but they don't want to solve it. And that's what people's attention needs to turn to, that the failure of the system is what is throwing fuel onto the fire of creating this hatred for the immigrant and creating hatred for the Muslim. And we as Muslims are to blame that we have not been able to do effective da'wah in order to reposition people's minds to say, look, this is your real problem. It's not the immigrants. And report after report has shown that immigration has shown a net positive for Britain, because the vast majority of immigrants that come to this country do work and are paying taxes, and they are of a younger demographic, so they are not a burden to the health system or a burden to the education system. So the reports and research carried out in this actually show that immigration helps Britain. And the majority of immigrants that come to Britain are legal immigrants. They are not illegal. The illegal immigration that they talk about, the people coming across on the dinghies, is a minute fraction of the actual immigrants that are coming to this country, because they are short-staffed in the hospitals. They are short-staffed in so many areas in Britain that they need the immigrants to come here in order to fulfill the job vacancies. So immigration is not a problem for Britain, but it's unfortunate that the majority of the people think that it is, because they have manufactured this hatred for the immigrant.
Yes, and also within the system, we know fingers are being pointed at where was the intelligence? Did the politicians see it coming? Did the government see it coming? And again, when we look at today's times, looking at technology and how effectively Britain has actually used technology on the war on terror, on individuals suspected of having links with terrorist organizations, the shared intelligence, recognition technology, all of that has been used in the past. And again, we're talking about where was the intelligence? Did they not see this thing coming with all the technology available to them?
It's a case of, when you hate somebody, your attention is always on that hatred. And you reason away. If you see anything else, you reason away. So, for example, if you look at these so-called acts of terrorism in Britain, right, by Muslims, it's individuals. And in many cases, there are individuals who are, maybe they've got mental problems, maybe they have been harassed and persecuted and they've got a vendetta against the state. Like many of these people were even known to the secret agencies, right? Many of the people who have committed acts of violence in Britain from the Muslim background, many of them have been known to the security forces. And many will claim that they were actually radicalized by the security forces because they were being persecuted and pursued, and all sorts of things were happening to them, you know, being banned from doing this and banned from doing that. So they created a hatred for the state. So you could say they created that. Now, on the other hand, when we've got people rioting in the streets, they are not being called terrorists. They are following a political agenda. They are committing acts of violence, but as yet, the politicians have not labeled this as terrorism. So, and when acts of terror were committed by non-Muslims, they were always reasoned away. Oh, he had a mental illness, they had this problem, that had problem. It was never because of their culture, their value, or their system. So the problem here is that they've taken their eye, you could say they've taken their eye off the ball, even though racism and extreme nationalism has been a problem for many decades in Britain. Let me give you an example. The very first job I had after I graduated from university was in the early 90s at a cable TV company in Lancashire, in a small town called Preston. And I used to work in the computer department, and some evenings I'd work late. And once I'd done my jobs, I'd have to wait for the jobs to complete on the computer. So I'd have a lot of dead time. So I would go and sit with the security guard. And, you know, he said, Inayet, he said this to me in 1993. He said to me, he goes, you know, you Muslims, you're stupid. And I was quite surprised. He just said it to me like that. I said, why do you say that? He goes, have you ever heard of Combat 18? And I said, no, I've never heard of them. He goes, and the gentleman speaking to me is an old Englishman. He goes, Combat 18 is a white extremist group here in Britain. And he goes, do you know what the 18 stands for? I said, I've got no idea. He goes, it stands for the letter of the alphabet, the first letter of the alphabet and the 8th letter of the alphabet, which is AH. He goes, do you know what that means? I said, I've got no idea what that means. It means Adolf Hitler. He goes, Combat 18 is a Nazi group here in Britain. They are arming themselves. They are getting weapons from the British Army. And they are able to do that because at the time of the Bosnian War, there were cases of people serving in the British Army passing down weapons to groups like Combat 18. And they are getting ready for a civil war against you people. And he goes, you don't even have a clue about this. Now, Inayet, this was happening in the early 90s, right? Can you imagine that with all the Islamophobia and all the propaganda which has happened over the last 2 decades and more since 9/11, what state that they are in? But the secret intelligence has always been focusing on the Muslims. And when they introduced legislation to monitor the Muslims, the CVE legislation, you know, countering so-called violent extremism, countering terrorism, it's all been focused on the Muslims. And this legislation has been used to arrest women writing poetry on the back of envelopes. That's been classed as terrorism. This, in the pro-Palestinian marches in London, people have been arrested for having stickers on their bodies with paragliders on. This has been deemed as supporting terrorism, and they've been charged under terrorist legislation. People have been, there was one man who was arrested under terrorist legislation who was a PhD student researching into some field. And part of his research meant that he had to read some of this material. So he legally acquired books from his academic sources, but he was arrested and held on terrorism charges for aiding and abetting terrorism. So you can see that this draconian way in which the Muslims were being pursued on terrorism. Whereas for the last 3-4 decades, right-wing extremist groups in Britain have been even arming themselves. There was a case, and I actually did a talk about this maybe about 10-15 years ago, where a serving police officer in the Greater Manchester Police Force was arrested for having weapons in his house, for having Nazi material in his house, extreme hatred of non-white people in his house. And he was charged for what? For having weapons without the necessary necessary license. So he wasn't charged under terrorism, even though he was associated to a right-wing extremist groups, and he had bomb-making instructions in his house. He had weapons in his house, and he had explosives in his house, but he was not charged for terrorism. So that's the climate we live in, where Muslims are being arrested for terrorism for having stickers on their clothing, and people who have got weapons in their house belonging to extreme groups being when they are arrested on other things like not having the correct licenses or having weapons without the necessary documentation. So then that's why we have got this problem now. And you know what? It could be that their society is going to suffer because of it. They've been too focused on the Muslims. We're not seeing whether a real problem is brewing in their own countries.
Well, Mazhar, I must say, Jazakallah khairan, as always, for taking time out with us here at Salam Media. It's been an absolute pleasure having you and Abdul Wahid on at the same time to discuss this topic. And we wish you well, my brother. And inshallah, we make dua for your safety and our brothers and sisters in the UK, inshallah. But as always, Jazakallah, Allah accept, Allah reward your efforts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
It's always a pleasure. Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Mazhar Khan joining us out of the UK, and we also had Abdul Wahid from the United Kingdom. And once again, as the UK braces itself with another day of rioting with far more right-wing racist riots reportedly planned in several cities, and many are monitoring these far-right communications, and they are fearing that these racist supremacist fascist mobs could possibly target many locations in the UK. And after this break, we are going to still continue staying with the story in the UK, and we will be joined by two other guests this evening. We'll be joined by Sheikh Michael and also Brother Mabrur Ahmed from Restless Beings, Sheikh Michael Momisa, Cambridge specialist, Livingston PhD scholar at the University of Cambridge. And so quick break, don't go away, stay with us.